What we believe matters. And I suspect most of you listening to this probably don't have a problem with that statement. But does it matter what the people that are around us think or believe? The people that we, shall we say, bring into relationship with us or fellowship? Yes, that also does. And we're going to take a look at that today as we continue here in 2 John. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we are working verse by verse through the book of 2 John. We left off in verse 6 yesterday, and verse 6 concludes, you must walk in love. This is our responsibility. But then he goes from that statement into verse 7 where he says, many deceivers have gone out into the world, and they do not confess or they do not agree that Jesus Christ is coming in flesh, or the coming of Jesus Christ in flesh. Now this word coming, if we were to go over to 1 John chapter 4, when he refers to this, it says that every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ has come in flesh is from God. And this word come here is a perfect tense, meaning that they came in flesh and they remain in flesh. And then he says every spirit that does not confess Jesus, and there's an ellipsis here, this did not come in flesh, this one is not from God. The difference over here is that our word coming is in the present tense. It's a present participle, and it's looking at Jesus as one that is coming. Even now, in this present time, we can view Jesus as coming in flesh, because even after he died on a cross, when he arose, he still is in flesh. He arose in flesh. He ascended in flesh. He sits at the Father's right hand. The writer of Hebrews states in chapter 10 that his flesh, sitting there in his human person on the throne, is our access to God, because he's a real person there. And so he says these people do not confess, or they do not agree that Jesus is coming in flesh. They don't really think that he's still in flesh, and they don't expect him to be coming. And he says this one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So he's talking about the same type of people that we were looking at in 1 John, these antichrists that deny that he's absolutely God, and or that Jesus or the Christ came in flesh, is actually a physical human being. This brings us, and so this is if you've been with these studies, if you haven't, go back and look at those sections over there in 1 John that talk about the Antichrist, and we've looked at this in several of those videos in 1 John, in this idea of what the Antichrist are, and look at that. So I'm not going to chase that anymore here. I think that what we've said is adequate. But verse 8 then, it says, watch yourselves. Now what we're seeing here is that these deceivers can negatively affect believers in Jesus Christ. So watch yourselves that you do not lose what we have worked for. And this word worked for that he's using over here means it's something we've already done. We've already done this work, but that you may receive a full reward. Now, what is it that these people have worked for that they could potentially not receive a full reward with regard to this? Let's go over to 1 John chapter 2 and remind ourselves, and I believe this is again part of the problem with these antichrists, and it's the way the young men are responding. He says, do not love the world, nor the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lusts for the flesh, the lusts or the cravings for the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And we talked about that, yes, there is a broad sense in which the world is a problem for us as believers in these things, but the specific problem here most likely is these people trying to use the world to reach the world like the Antichrist reached the world. They want to figure that out. They don't understand how the Antichrist were so successful, so they're trying to love the world in that way. And he reminds them the world is passing away, and also its lusts or its cravings. But the one who does the will of God lives, doesn't live forever. Literally, it abides or is at ease into the age. In other words, as age goes on, he's not all flustered by the fact that the world is constantly changing. You know, he's always trying to keep up with it. But the point is, going back to this first statement here, that anyone has this love for the world, the love for the Father is not in him. You can't be loving the Father and loving the world, which, if you keep this in the larger context of 1 John, you love the Father by loving his children. That's at the end of chapter 4 and the first part of chapter 5, which we looked at in those studies. So if we come over here to 1 John 3, he makes this important distinction. He says, the one who practices sin, or the one doing sin, is from the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. So he's talking about the fact that these antichrists and these unbelievers, they don't have a big problem with sin. They sin, and John's saying you need to recognize these people sin from a beginning. This is a really big deal. They don't seem to think it's a problem, but it is a problem. And if we go over to James chapter 1, verse 12, it says, blessed or happy, this particular word blessed is a word for happy. Happy is the man who perseveres or bears up under temptation. I would take this as temptation, not trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. See, so here's a love for the Lord that we receive as a crown of life for bearing up under temptation. In other words, you could bear up under temptation simply because you're just trying to be good. Bear up under temptation because you don't want to get in trouble. You don't want to be naughty. Or you could bear up under temptation saying, my Lord has provided for me to be free from this. I can take this freedom and I can experience freedom from temptation rather than giving into it. And there's a crown of life associated with that. We have a similar statement over here in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. We're going to go, he's talking, this is one of Jesus speaking to one of the 7 churches here in Revelation. It says here in verse 8, and to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation, or your trouble, and your poverty, but you are rich. So materially they're impoverished, but spiritually they're rich, is what he's getting at. And the blasphemy, or the slander by those who say they are Jews and are not, but they're really a synagogue of Satan. I think that these are probably Christians, or people that claim to be Christians, but they're claiming to be Jews because they're putting themselves under law, is I really believe what's happening here. And so in reality, they're a synagogue of Satan when they function that way. And probably aren't believers, but they claim to be Christians. They claim to be people that were part of the church. Verse 10, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some from you into prison, and you're going to be tested. And that word tested that he uses here, I'm going to pull this up here so that we can see it. It's our word pyrazo for a temptation. So the test is a temptation that Satan expects us to fail under. And you will have tribulation for 10 days, but be faithful unto the death, up to the point of death. I mean, once they kill you, you don't have to worry about this anymore. But to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Again, that crown of life, as we just saw over in James 1, is for resisting temptation. But he says you need to be faithful to death. In other words, Satan can manipulate people in the world by fear of death, by suffering in prison in this case. They can cause these kinds of problems. So in the same way that we saw that these antichrists, they sin without end. This is the nature of their life, the way they sin. We see that over there that James is concerned about these people bearing up under temptation and receiving the full crown of life. Jesus is concerned about this as he talks to the church in Smyrna, that they would receive this crown of life for bearing up under temptation. And these people being influenced, potentially being called, if you remember as we started, to walk in love, but they could be distracted from that walk of love and not be loving believers because they might be loving the world system. They could also just neglect the matter of sin and not worry about sin. Oh, sin, I don't care about sin. Maybe I sin, maybe I don't, I'm not worried about it. So they're like the Antichrist, which means they're going to sin more commonly, more often, if they don't recognize this, and they're not loving, as we saw over there, you're not loving the Lord. And so he says these deceivers have gone out in the world. They're making these deceptive statements about who Christ is. And he says you need to watch yourselves so you don't lose what we've worked for. In other words, you've been living this Christian life, you've been loving other believers, but boy, you could go off the rails and you could, shall we say, ruin your testimony here and not receive this full reward. I don't believe this full reward has anything to do with our ability to reign with Christ in the future or anything like that, because that's something that's granted to us all completely by the grace of God as He completes our salvation. These rewards, as we just saw over there in James, has to do with a victor's wreath that we receive. And if we went on in the book of Revelation, we see that we just end up very shortly throwing them back at His feet, recognizing He's the one that's worthy for that we even have these. And so He says that you might receive a full reward. In other words, there's a potential for a believer, shall we say, to go off the rails if you don't pay attention to this teaching. So let's say you're in a church like this and you have these antichrists in there, and they're teaching things that are not true about Jesus Christ. They don't believe He's coming in flesh. This is not what they think. As we saw in 1 John, they don't think that He's God, and they don't think that He actually has come and exists as a physical being, in addition to being God. And they have these problems. And now John adds here, they don't even believe He's coming in flesh. That they're denying His physical resurrection, essentially, as part of what's happening here. All of this comes together. And if you listen to these people and they're around you, just as we saw in 1 John, it begins to influence you. And it was kind of causing a little bit of a problem for some of the spiritually immature believers over there in 1 John. And he was concerned for them. But he says, you know what? You can watch yourself. You can pay attention to what's going on and listen to these people. And, well, you can receive a full reward versus not receiving a full reward. Again, now this is a reminder. See, when we invite into the church, when we allow people to participate and stay in the church, we're not kicking unsaved people out. But when you get unsaved people in there, you need to recognize they're not the same as you. They don't think as you. And if they just stick around and you start letting them have a lot of input in what's going on and you start trying to fellowship with them, eventually what you're going to find with those people is that they're going to start influencing the way you think. And as they affect the way you think, they will also affect the way you live. And you may not receive that full reward that you might for bearing up under temptation, as James writes, as Jesus states to the church at Smyrna. Hopefully that helps you understand what he means about that you might receive a full reward and the danger of just not making a big deal, not caring about these unsaved people that float into our churches and then sit down and get comfortable with us. They do, just as we saw in 1 John, they do or can have a negative impact on believers. They could have a negative impact on you or even on me. Don't do that. As John said, love one another. Have a great day in the Lord, setting your mind to who you are there. And as always, thank you for joining me.